June 12, 2024, the day the Caribbean held its breath. Let me tell you about the moment that didn't make the front page of the New York Times or the lead segment on CNN, but should have. On that sweltering Wednesday afternoon, a Venezuelan Sabalo-class diesel-electric submarine, one of the few operational boats in Caracas' aging fleet, slipped its moorings in Puerto Cabello and vanished into the Caribbean. Officially, it was just another routine patrol. Unofficially, it was the first time in decades that a Latin American submarine had deliberately shadowed a U.S. carrier strike group in international waters. And if you think that's just another day in the life of the U.S. Navy, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of naval power, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. I've advised defense planners, briefed congressional committees, and watched as the same patterns repeat themselves: overconfidence, miscalculation, and the dangerous illusion that military superiority alone can solve geopolitical problems. What happened in June wasn't just a submarine tracking a carrier. It was a microcosm of the new Cold War, a test of resolve, and a warning that the rules of engagement in the Western Hemisphere are being rewritten right under our noses. But before we get into what's really happening, let's start with the story they want you to believe. The official routine encounter, nothing to see here. According to the Pentagon's initial readout, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was conducting freedom of navigation operations in the Caribbean when it detected a potential contact on June 10. By June 12, U.S. Southern Command confirmed that the contact was a Venezuelan Sabalo-class submarine, one of two in service, operating in what they called a professional but assertive manner. The Navy's statement was careful: almost the U.S. Navy routinely interacts with foreign military units during operations. These interactions are conducted in a safe and professional manner. The media, predictably, ran with the sanitized version. Reuters called it a brief encounter. The Wall Street Journal framed it as Venezuela flexing its muscles in response to U.S. sanctions. The Miami Herald quoted a retired admiral who dismissed the incident as posturing, nothing more. Even the Venezuelan government played along, with Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez calling it a standard naval exercise and accusing the U.S. of paranoia. But here's the problem with this: it's incomplete. The data doesn't support the idea that this was just another routine patrol. The Sabalo isn't some rusting relic, it's a modernized Type 209/1300 submarine, acquired from Germany in the 1980s and upgraded with Russian and Iranian assistance over the last decade. It's quiet, it's lethal, and it's one of the few platforms in the Venezuelan inventory that can actually threaten a U.S. carrier. More importantly, the Ford CSG wasn't just passing through. It had been repositioned from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean in late May, a move that coincided with rising tensions over Venezuela's disputed election, its deepening military ties with Russia and China, and the Maduro regime's increasingly aggressive posture toward Guyana over the Essequibo dispute. So why the sudden submarine deployment? And why now? Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the timing. The Sabalo didn't just happen to be in the right place at the right time. According to intelligence sources I've spoken with, the submarine had been pre-positioned near the Aves Island archipelago, a strategic choke point in the eastern Caribbean, for at least a week before the Ford arrived. That's not a coincidence. That's a calculated move. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. has known for years that Venezuela's submarine fleet is a paper tiger. The second Sabalo-class boat, the Cartwright, has been non-operational since 2019 due to maintenance issues. The Ford CSG, with its Aegis-equipped escorts and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, could detect and neutralize the Sabalo in minutes if it came to that. So why the sudden show of force? Because this wasn't about the submarine. It was about the message. Venezuela isn't just a failed state with a collapsing economy. It's a geopolitical chess piece in a much larger game. And right now, three major powers are jockeying for influence in Russia, China, and Iran. Each has its own reasons for keeping Maduro in power, and each has been quietly exiting its military footprint in Venezuela. Let's break it. 1. Russia's the Wagner of the Caribbean. Moscow has been Maduro's lifeline since the U.S. first imposed sanctions in 2017. Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil giant, has been helping Venezuela evade U.S. restrictions by blending and rebranding Venezuelan crude. But the real game changer came in 2022, when Russia deployed a contingent of Wagner Group mercenaries rebranded as private military contractors to train Venezuelan special forces and protect key oil infrastructure. Then, in March 2024, Russia announced the establishment of a permanent naval presence in Venezuela, with plans to rotate warships through Puerto Cabello. The Sabalos patrol wasn't just a Venezuelan operation, it was a Russian-backed one. Here's the Sabalo was equipped with Russian-made Kh-35 Iran anti-ship missiles, which can be launched from its torpedo tubes. That's not a defensive weapon. That's a carrier killer. And while the US would almost certainly detect and destroy the submarine before it could get within firing range, the mere fact that Venezuela now has the capability to threaten a US carrier is a game-changer. 2. China's long debt traps and dual-use ports. Beijing has been playing the long game in Venezuela for over a decade. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has poured billions into Venezuelan infrastructure, ports, railways, and, most critically, telecommunications. But the real prize is oil. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, and China has been happy to prop up Maduro in exchange for sweetheart deals on crude. What's less talked about is China's military footprint. In 2023, China completed a deep-water port action in La Guaira, just outside Caracas. Officially, it's a commercial facility. Unofficially, it's designed to accommodate Chinese naval vessels. And then there's the satellite tracking station in El Sombrero, a facility that, according to leaked intelligence reports, has been used to monitor U.S. naval movements in the Caribbean. The Sabalos patrol wasn't just a Venezuelan operation. It was a test of China's ability to project power into America's backyard. 3. Iran's wild the proxy war next door. Iran's involvement in Venezuela is the most underreported aspect of this story. Since 2020, Iran has been sending oil tankers to Venezuela, bypassing U.S. sanctions with the help of Russian and Chinese middlemen. But the real concern is Iran's military cooperation. In 2021, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps established a drone factory in Venezuela, producing the Mohajer 6, a drone capable of carrying precision-guided munitions. In 2023, Iran reportedly transferred ballistic missile technology to Venezuela, though both countries deny it. The Sabalos patrol was a signal to we're not just a problem in the Middle East anymore. And if you think the US can contain Iran in the Persian Gulf while ignoring its growing presence in the Caribbean, you're deluding yourself. So what's really happening here? Venezuela isn't acting alone. It's the tip of the spear for a broader anti-American coalition, one that includes Russia, China, and Iran. And the Sabalos patrol wasn't just a show of force. It was a demonstration of how quickly the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere is shifting. The exited geopolitical the new Cold War comes to the Caribbean. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing in the Caribbean isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of American unipolarity and the return of great power competition to a region the U.S. has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine, America's 19th-century declaration that the Western Hemisphere was off-limits to European powers, was the bedrock of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. After the Cold War, Washington took its dominance for granted. The Soviet Union was gone. China was still a developing country. And Latin America, with a few exceptions, was a collection of US-aligned democracies. That world is gone. Today, we're in a multipolar system where the US is no longer the sole superpower. Russia is resurgent. China is a global economic and military powerhouse. And Iran, while weaker than its rivals, is a disruptive force that thrives on chaos. Each of these powers has its own reasons for challenging US dominance in Latin. Russia wants to distract the US from Ukraine by opening a second front in its backyard. Every dollar and every soldier Washington commits to the Caribbean is a dollar and a soldier not available for Eastern Europe. China sees Latin America as a critical source of raw materials and a market for its exports. It also wants to erode U.S. influence in the region, replacing it with a network of client states dependent on Beijing. Iran is using Venezuela as a forward operating base to project power into the Western Hemisphere. If the U.S. is bogged down dealing with Iranian-backed militias in the Middle East, it has fewer resources to counter Tehran's activities in Latin America. This is the new Cold War, and the Caribbean is the latest battleground. But here's the difference between now and the 20th: the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon. It's a superpower in relative decline, stretched thin by 2 decades of war in the Middle East, a rising China in the Pacific, and a resurgent Russia in Europe. And its adversaries know it. Now, let's talk about the historical parallels. In 1962, the world came to the brink of nuclear war over Soviet missiles in Cuba. Today, the stakes are lower, but the dynamics are eerily similar. The US has a carrier strike group in the Caribbean. Russia, China, and Iran have proxies in Venezuela. And just like in 1962, miscalculation could lead to disaster. But there's one key: back then, the US and the Soviet Union had clear red lines in back-channel communications to prevent escalation. Today, those lines are blurred, and the channels are broken. Military and strategic: why this isn't just another drill. Let's talk about the military reality of what just happened. The Gerald R. Ford CSG is the most advanced carrier strike group in the world. It's equipped with F-35C stealth fighters, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, and Aegis-equipped destroyers that can detect and track submarines hundreds of miles away. The Sabalo, by comparison, is a 40-year-old diesel-electric boat with limited range and outdated sensors. On paper, this should have been a non-event. The Ford's escorts would have detected the Sabalo within hours of it leaving port, tracked it with sonar buoys and P-8 Poseidons, and forced it to surface or retreat. And that's exactly what happened this time. But here's where it gets: this wasn't a one-off. Venezuela has been quietly modernizing its military with Russian and Iranian help. In 2023, it took delivery of a batch of Iranian-made ballistic missiles, capable of striking targets up to 700 kilometers away. It's also acquired Russian S-300 air defense systems, which could complicate US airstrikes in the event of a conflict. And then there are the drones, hundreds of them, supplied by Iran and China, which could be used to swarm US ships or conduct kamikaze attacks. Now, let me be: Venezuela is not an existential threat to the US. Its military is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s, and its economy is in shambles. But in a crisis, say, a US attempt to overthrow Maduro or a Venezuelan attack on Guyana, it could inflict real damage. And that's the pod. The Sabalos patrol wasn't about winning a war. It was about deterrence. The message to Washington was: if you come for us, it won't be a cakewalk. And that's where the real danger lies. The US has a long history of underestimating its adversaries. In Iraq, we thought we'd be greeted as liberators. In Afghanistan, we thought we could build a democracy in a decade. In Libya, we thought we could topple Gaddafi without consequences. And in Ukraine, we thought Russia would collapse in weeks. Now, we're making the same mistake in Venezuela. The hawks in Washington, particularly in the Republican Party, are pushing for a more aggressive posture. They want to impose a naval blockade. They want to arm the Venezuelan opposition. They want to restore democracy at the barrel of a gun. But here's the: Venezuela isn't Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. It's not even Libya. It's a country with a population of 28 million, a military that's been hardened by years of sanctions and internal repression, and powerful allies in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. A US intervention wouldn't be a quick surgical strike. It would be a prolonged, bloody conflict, one that could easily spiral into a regional war. And let's not forget the lessons of history. In 1961, the US backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous attempt to overthrow Castro. In 1983, we invaded Grenada to oust a Marxist government. In 1989, we toppled Noriega in AMA. Each time, the US won the battle but lost the war, fueling anti-Americanism, destabilizing the region, and creating power vacuums that were filled by even worse actors. So before we start talking about regime change in Venezuela, we need to ask: what's the end game? The domestic political: why Venezuela is a 2024 election issue. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the politics. Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic political football. And in an election year, that makes it even more dangerous. For the Biden administration, Venezuela is a no-win situation. On one hand, the White House has been trying to ease tensions with Maduro, offering sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms. On the other hand, it's under immense pressure from Florida's Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities, key swing voters in a state that could decide the election, to take a harder line. Then there's the Republican Party, which has made Venezuela a central part of its 2024 platform. Donald Trump, in particular, has been pushing for a more aggressive approach, including the possibility of military action. His allies in Congress, like Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, have been beating the war drums for years, framing Venezuela as a national security threat. But here's the: neither side has a coherent strategy. The Biden administration's approach, sanctions, diplomacy, and occasional military posturing, hasn't worked. Maduro is still in power, the economy is still in freefall, and Russia and China are still extending their influence. Meanwhile, the Republicans' saber-rattling plays well with their base, but it ignores the reality that military action would be a disaster. And that's the real danger. In an election year, foreign policy becomes a tool for domestic politics. The temptation to do something about Venezuela, to score political points, to look tough, to distract from domestic problems, is enormous. But history shows that when foreign policy is driven by electoral politics, the results are almost always disastrous. Just look at Iraq in 2003. The Bush administration invaded not because Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat, but because it needed a quick victory to boost its poll numbers after September 11. The result? A war that cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and destabilized the entire Middle East. We can't afford to make the same mistake in Venezuela. Scenario how this could play out. So where do we go from here? Let's game out the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the Cold War freeze. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela settle into a new normal, a low-intensity Cold War in the Caribbean. The Ford CSG continues its patrols, but the US avoids direct confrontation. Maduro stays in power, but his regime becomes increasingly isolated. Russia and China continue to prop him up, but their support is limited by their own economic problems. Iran, meanwhile, uses Venezuela as a base for proxy attacks against US interests in the region. This is the most likely scenario, but it's also the most unstable. Neither side wants war, but neither side is willing to back down. The risk of miscalculation is high, and over time, the tensions could escalate into something worse. Scenario 2, the proxy war. In this scenario, the US and its allies, particularly Colombia and Guyana, begin arming and training Venezuelan opposition groups. Maduro responds by cracking down harder, leading to a civil conflict. Russia and Iran increase their military support for Maduro, while China provides economic lifelines. The US imposes a naval blockade, and Venezuela retaliates by attacking oil tankers in the Caribbean. This is the most dangerous scenario. It's not a full-scale war, but it's not peace either. It's a grinding, bloody conflict that could drag on for years, destabilizing the entire region. Scenario 3, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Scenario 3, the Cuban Missile Crisis Redux. Now, what most people don't realize is that this scenario isn't just some far-fetched Hollywood script, it's already happened before, just with different players. In 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other point in history because of a single Soviet submarine in the Caribbean. The B-59, a Foxtrot-class boat, was armed with a nuclear torpedo, and when US destroyers began dropping depth charges near it, the Soviet captain nearly launched. Only the intervention of a second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented Armageddon. That's how close we came. And that's the kind of pressure we're talking about here. Let me explain why this matters. If Venezuela were to deploy a diesel-electric submarine, say, one of the Russian-built Kilo-class boats it acquired in the 2000s, into the path of a US carrier strike group, the dynamics would shift instantly. The Kilo is a quiet hunter, designed to lurk in shallow waters where sonar is less effective. It's not as advanced as a US Virginia-class submarine, but in the confined waters of the Caribbean, it doesn't need to be. A single torpedo could cripple a destroyer or even an amphibious assault ship. And if that torpedo were to carry a nuclear warhead, something Venezuela has never confirmed but has been rumored to possess since the Chavez era, the stakes become existential. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities, while formidable, are not infallible. During the Cold War, Soviet submarines routinely slipped past U.S. picket lines. In 2009, a British Astute-class submarine collided with a French nuclear sub during NATO exercises; both were undetected. And in 2015, a Swedish Kilo-class submarine, the Rostov-on-Don, managed to evade NATO forces for weeks in the Baltic Sea. If a Venezuelan sub were to do the same in the Caribbean, the political fallout would be immediate. The U.S. would have to respond, but how? A limited strike on Venezuelan naval bases? That risks escalation. A blockade? That's an act of war. And if the sub were to sink a U.S. ship even accidentally, the pressure for retaliation would be overwhelming. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964? A single disputed naval engagement led to a decade of war in Vietnam. Now imagine that, but with a nuclear-capable adversary. The broader geopolitical implications are even more alarming. Russia and China would almost certainly use the crisis to their advantage. Moscow has already sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in the past, most recently in 2018, when two Tu-160s landed at Nicosia Airport. If a U.S. carrier were to be hit, Putin would have the perfect pretext to escalate. He could deploy more subs to the region, or even station tactical nukes in Cuba, just as Khrushchev did in 1962. China, meanwhile, would use the chaos to extend its influence in Latin America, offering economic aid to Venezuela in exchange for basing rights or rare earth mineral concessions. And let's not forget Iran. Tehran has been quietly building ties with Caracas for years, supplying drones, cyber capabilities, and even ballistic missile technology. In 2020, the U.S. seized a shipment of Iranian missiles bound for Venezuela. If a conflict were to break out, Iran would almost certainly use Venezuelan territory to launch proxy attacks against U.S. interests, just as it did in Iraq and Syria. We could see Hezbollah cells activating in Colombia, or Iranian-made drones striking U.S. bases in the region. The military implications are just as dire. A U.S. carrier strike group is a floating fortress, but it's not invincible. The Ford-class carriers are the most advanced in the world, but they're also vulnerable to saturation attacks. A swarm of Venezuelan fast attack boats, armed with anti-ship missiles, could overwhelm the carrier's defenses. The U.S. Navy's Aegis combat system is designed to handle multiple threats, but it's not perfect. In 2000, the USS Cole was nearly sunk by a single suicide boat in Yemen. Now imagine that, but with dozens of boats attacking at once. And then there's the cyber threat. Venezuela has been investing heavily in electronic warfare, with help from Russia and China. In 2019, the U.S. accused Venezuela of jamming GPS signals in the Caribbean, disrupting commercial air traffic. If a conflict were to break out, we could see cyber attacks on U.S. military networks, or even attempts to blind the carrier's sensors. The U.S. has robust cyber defenses, but no system is foolproof. A single breach could have catastrophic consequences. The most likely outcome, though, isn't a full-scale war, it's a prolonged standoff, with both sides probing each other's defenses and looking for weaknesses. The U.S. would likely impose a naval blockade, cutting off Venezuela's oil exports and strangling its economy. Maduro would respond by attacking oil tankers or even U.S. commercial shipping, just as Iran did in the Persian Gulf in 2019. The U.S. would retaliate with airstrikes, but without a clear endgame. And all the while, Russia and China would be watching, waiting for an opportunity to exploit the chaos. The real danger isn't that either side wants war, it's that neither side has a clear off-ramp. The U.S. can't afford to back down, not with an election looming and a base that demands toughness. Maduro can't afford to back down either, not with his regime on the brink of collapse. And so the two sides would be locked in a deadly game of chicken, with the entire region held hostage. The lesson here isn't that war is inevitable, it's that the current approach is unsustainable. The U.S. can't keep treating Venezuela like a rogue state without considering the consequences. Sanctions haven't worked. Military threats haven't worked. And regime change operations, like the 2019 coup attempt, have only made things worse. What we need is a new strategy, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the dangers of overreach. But that's not what we're getting. Instead, we're seeing the same old sanctions, saber rattling, and the occasional covert operation. It's a recipe for disaster, and if we're not careful, we could find ourselves in a crisis that spirals out of control, just like in 1962. The difference is, this time, there might not be a Vasily Arkhipov to save us. Now, what most people don't realize is how deeply this crisis is tied to the domestic politics of both countries and how those internal pressures make de-escalation nearly impossible. Let's start with Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro isn't just some cartoonish dictator clinging to power for the sake of it. He's a survivor, and his regime's calculus is shaped by two brutal: first, that the opposition is fractured and weak, and second, that the military remains his only real pillar of support. But that support isn't absolute. The generals who prop him up aren't ideologues, they're pragmatists who've enriched themselves through corruption, drug trafficking, and the plunder of Venezuela's state-owned enterprises. They tolerate Maduro because he keeps the system running, but if they sense he's becoming a liability, they'll cut him loose faster than you can say golpe de Estado. This is where the submarine scenario becomes so dangerous. Maduro knows that any direct military confrontation with the US would force the military's hand. If the US sinks a Venezuelan ship or strikes a military base, the generals would have to choose between defending the regime and risking their own necks or making a deal with Washington to save themselves. That's why Maduro's threats are always just aggressive enough to rally nationalist sentiment but never so reckless that they trigger a coup. He's walking a razor's edge, and the moment he slips, the regime could collapse like a house of cards. But here's the uncomfortable: the US isn't much better at managing its own domestic pressures. Every time Washington ratchets up the rhetoric against Venezuela, it's not just about geopolitics, it's about domestic politics. The Biden administration, like every administration before it, knows that appearing tough on Venezuela plays well with Cuban-American voters in Florida, a state that could decide the next election. And let's not forget the role of the U.S. defense industry, which has a vested interest in hyping threats to justify bigger budgets. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, for example, included $50 million for democracy promotion in Venezuela, code for funding opposition groups in covert operations. That's not strategy, that's theater. Now, let's talk about the most likely scenario if this standoff escalates. Imagine the Venezuelan submarine, let's call it the Caribbean, manages to evade U.S. detection and fires a torpedo at a U.S. destroyer. The U.S. retaliates with airstrikes on Venezuelan naval bases, and suddenly, we're in a shooting war. What happens next? The U.S. public, which has been fed a steady diet of Venezuela is a failed state narratives, would likely rally behind the president. But the moment U.S. casualties start piling up, the political calculus changes. Remember the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing? The Reagan administration withdrew U.S. forces from Lebanon after 241 Marines were killed. Or more recently, the 2020 Iranian missile strike on U.S. bases in Iraq, which forced Trump to back down from further escalation. The American public has a low tolerance for wars that don't have a clear victory condition. Maduro, for his part, would use any U.S. attack as a propaganda bonanza. He'd frame it as an imperialist invasion, rallying support from his base and even some of the opposition who might otherwise oppose him. We saw this in 2019, when Juan Guaido's attempted coup fizzled out because the military refused to defect. The more the U.S. pushes, the more Maduro can paint himself as the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. And let's not forget the regional dynamics. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina would condemn U.S. military action, not out of love for Maduro, but out of fear of setting a precedent. The last thing Latin American leaders want is a return to the days of U.S. gunboat diplomacy. But the real wildcard here is Russia and China. Both countries have invested heavily in Venezuela, not out of altruism, but because they see it as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Russia has already sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018, and China has lent the regime over $60 billion since 2007, most of which will never be repaid. If the US were to launch a full-scale invasion, Russia and China would have to respond, not because they care about Maduro, but because they can't afford to look weak. We could see Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group deployed to Venezuela, or Chinese cyber attacks on US infrastructure. And that's when things get really messy. So where does this leave us? The most probable outcome isn't a full-blown war, but a prolonged crisis that bleeds Venezuela dry while doing little to change the regime's behavior. The US would tighten sanctions, Venezuela would lash out with asymmetric attacks, and the cycle of misery would continue. The Venezuelan people, who've already suffered through hyperinflation, mass emigration, and a collapsed healthcare system, would bear the brunt of it. And for what? To satisfy the domestic political needs of a few hundred politicians in Washington and Caracas? Here's what I think needs to happen. First, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a geopolitical chess piece and start treating it as a humanitarian crisis. The 2019 sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry didn't topple Maduro, they just made life worse for ordinary Venezuelans. If the US really wants to weaken the regime, it should focus on targeting the generals and elites who keep Maduro in power, not the people who are already starving. Second, the US needs to engage with regional partners to create a diplomatic off-ramp. The Lima Group, which was formed in 2017 to coordinate a response to Venezuela's crisis, has been ineffective because it's seen as a US puppet. A more inclusive approach, one that includes countries like Mexico and Argentina, could help isolate Maduro without triggering a nationalist backlash. And finally, the US needs to accept that regime change in Venezuela isn't going to happen through military force or economic pressure. The only way Maduro leaves power is if the military decides he's no longer useful. That means the US should be working behind The alternative is a slow-motion disaster, one that could drag on for years and destabilize an entire region. And if we're not careful, we'll look back on this moment and wonder why we didn't see it coming. Because the warning signs are all there. We just have to be willing to read them. Now, what most people don't realize is that the Venezuelan military isn't a monolith. It's a fractured institution, split between the high command who've grown OB. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The crisis isn't just about oil or democracy, it's about the future of US influence in Latin America. For the past 2 decades, Washington has treated the region as a secondary theater, a place to outsource problems to local proxies while focusing on the Middle East and Asia. That's a mistake. China and Russia haven't made the same error. Beijing has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt-trap diplomacy, offering loans in exchange for oil and infrastructure contracts that lock Caracas into long-term dependence. Moscow, meanwhile, has used Venezuela as a forward operating base for its military and intelligence operations, deploying nuclear-capable bombers to the country in 2018 and deepening ties with the Venezuelan military. If the US doesn't recalibrate its approach, it risks ceding an entire hemisphere to its rivals, not through invasion, but through neglect. Here's the uncomfortable: the US doesn't have a grand strategy for Latin America. What it has is a series of ad hoc policies, sanctions here, a coup attempt there, the occasional humanitarian aid drop, all designed to placate domestic audiences rather than solve problems. The Biden administration's recent moves, like easing some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for electoral concessions, are a step in the right direction, but they're too little, too late. The damage has already been done. The Venezuelan state is a hollowed-out shell, the military is a law unto itself, and the opposition is fractured between those who want to negotiate and those who want to fight. The window for a peaceful transition is closing, and if it slams shut, the consequences won't be confined to Venezuela. So what are the alternatives? The first is the status: more sanctions, more saber-rattling, more suffering. It's the path of least resistance, and it's the one the US is most likely to take. The second is a full-court press on regime change, which would require a level of commitment, military, economic, diplomatic, that Washington hasn't shown since the Cold War. The third, and most realistic, is a managed transition, where the US works with regional partners to create a face-saving exit for Maduro while ensuring the military doesn't collapse into warlordism. This would require something the US has struggled with in recent: patience. I've spent enough time in Caracas and Washington to know that patience isn't a virtue either capital possesses in abundance. But if there's one lesson from the past 2 decades of US foreign policy, it's that military force and economic coercion rarely produce the outcomes we want. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, these aren't just cautionary tales, they're roadmaps for how not to do things. Venezuela doesn't need another failed state in the Western Hemisphere. It needs a way out. The question is whether anyone in power is willing to take it. The US has the tools to make this work: diplomatic leverage, economic incentives, intelligence assets, but it lacks the political will. The Venezuelan opposition has the moral high ground, but it lacks unity. The military has the guns, but it lacks a coherent vision for the future. And Maduro? He's playing a weak hand brilliantly, using every crisis as an opportunity to consolidate power. That's the genius of it. Doesn't need to win, it just needs everyone else to lose. So here we are, at the edge of another avoidable disaster. The warning signs are flashing red, but no one in Washington seems to be looking. The Venezuelan people are exhausted, the region is fracturing, and the great powers are circling like vultures. The only thing left to decide is how much worse it gets before someone blinks. And if history is any guide, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better.